we may, as critics, view it as a feature of neoliberal policies that have made, marginalization of urban populations a source of profit for some. That may be. In fact, I find that critique fairly convincing. But that's not how mass incarceration was sold to the public. It was sold to the public as a decent, law-abiding way to deal with extremely dangerous people who would otherwise threaten California's neighborhoods. That's how it was offered. Now, I'm not saying people were wise to accept that empirical premise, but that is how they were told, what they were told about prisons. And I think these two criminologists that I'm quoting here highlight for me what are the real vulnerabilities of mass incarceration at this moment in time. This is a quote from Bernard Harcourt, who writes at the end of his essay, Reducing Mass Incarceration, the question is whether the public imagination of the convict could ever be reshaped. And I think what he's saying there is we have this public image of the convict as a permanently dangerous, young, physically aggressive predator. That's exactly the image that Justice Scalia was scaring up when he talked about 46,000 criminals coming out of prison. And what Harcourt is saying is, as long as we imagine that that's who prisoners are, it's possible we're going to accept a lot of degrading, inhumane conditions. But what if we began to see prisoners as sick, older than you might think, decades past the time that they committed, whenever the crimes they committed were changed? 40% of prisoners in America are chronically ill. They have things like hypertension, renal failure. Mass incarceration actually selects people with chronic illnesses, because if you're a routine drug user, you're much more likely to have a chronic illness. If you've been in and out of prisons and jails, you're more likely to have a chronic illness. All of which means that when you go inside California prisons today or look at these images from the case, what you see are often a population of people more at risk than they are of risk. The other quote comes from John Pratt, a New Zealand criminologist, who points out that mass incarceration has its own structure of legitimacy. It's a legitimacy premised on the idea that we are protecting innocent people from dangerous, guilty people, and we're doing it in a decent and humane way. Well, that premise can be falsified. And if the system is shown to be inhuman and indecent, and if the system is shown not to protect the public, but actually to make prisoners worse and let them back out into the community in worse shape than they were, then it loses the consent that lie behind it. And I believe we're at that kind of a moment, or potentially at that kind of a moment. Now, if you want to get a feel for how sweeping a change this could hint at, look again at Europe, where a very different and much more restrained penal enterprise has been thoroughly shaped by the influence of human rights norms. And this comes from, one of the definitive study of European prison law and policy. And I don't have time to give you a lot of detail on it, but I can talk about it in Q&A. When it comes to health, which is the hallmark of the Plata and Coleman case, you've got a whole body of European human rights institutions and norms that are focused on that health problem. I think part of what Brown has given us is a kind of humanitarian medical crisis that we can begin to rethink prisons around, right? It's a moment like the John Howard moment in the 18th century where we can begin to consider the humanity of prisoners again. And in Europe, they don't have to rely on courts to, after enormous litigation pressure from lawyers, challenge prison conditions. They have an institution which is an integral part of the modern human rights framework called the Committee for the Prevention of Torture. The UN has a similar body. This is a non-court. It's a proactive institution made up of lawyers, doctors, psychiatrists, and academic specialists that have total legal authority to enter any prison or any mental hospital or any place of confinement, an immigration detention center, interrogation center, in all of Europe without notice, without warning. They can inspect it. They have no hard law power to order anyone released. But what they can do is produce reports that essentially shame European governments into improving conditions in their prisons. And this has had a tremendous impact on preventing European prisons from going in the direction we have. I would end this overly long lecture by suggesting that one of the things we ought to think about here in California, where we do, for at least the present, have the ballot initiative as a way that we can actually create new institutions that haven't been given to us by our current Constitution, this seems to me like an appropriate time to create something called the California Committee for the Prevention of Torture. Maybe as a way of beginning to atone for this lengthy human rights violation that Brown versus Plata documents that we have conducted on hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens. We ought to commit ourselves, like Europe did after World War II, to an institution that can take a proactive role in preventing this and actually would be a very important way to make sure that realignment doesn't simply hide the ball. So I think I'm going to end there so I can leave at least some time for Q&A. So let me just sort of stop and I'll leave that slide sort of up, if I may. You know, as you can imagine, it's a very speculative number. Obviously, Stalin he didn't even have sort of the Nazis' fascination with keeping accurate statistics. But criminologists have tried to estimate it at what it would have been at, and it comes very close to what we are roughly now at about 450 per 100,000. Remember, the Soviet Union is a very large country. It's, again, hard to define exactly what a prison is in Stalinist terms because there's a lot of people on work camps and other facilities. But the last time we had tough competition for sort of the carceral king of the planet, as it were, was, you know, the Soviet Union and then the South Africa before apartheid ended. And now, you know,
right now, I think I looked this up in preparation for this. Right now, we're ahead of Rwanda. And Rwanda, since they killed a lot of people,
lower population, and they may have a lot of former war criminals.
In the world of incarceration, it's not like Britain, for example, is 68,000.
And they, by European standards, Britain has a lot of people in prison. Yeah.
Yes. What strategies is California looking at to take to reduce its prison population by 2 years from now?
Great question. So one of the amazing things about the Brown versus Plata litigation, partly under the pressure of that Prison Litigation Reform Act and the whole question of public safety, the court actually had to look into how can you reduce prison populations without increasing crime, right? That's kind of the $64 million question. We put all these people in prison. Americans kind of get that there's too many people in prison. But what everyone wants to know is, can you do it without releasing the next Philip Garrido, right? We don't want more sex offenders kidnapping kids on our streets. How can you do that? And so of the 14 days of hearings that the 3-judge court held, 13 days were on that very question. And they had some of the best criminologists in the country look at it. And basically, what they recommended were 3 strategies. One, stop this endless recycling of parole violators. It's a very well-known secret in California. In fact, I wrote my dissertation on this in 1989 and published a book called Poor Discipline on this in 1993. Half of all prison admissions in California in the 80s and 90s and the first decade or so of this century came from parole violators, right? It's not courts sending people for committing a new felony. It's a parole system saying, you didn't show up for your appointment. You turned in a dirty drug test. We're sending you back. Usually for 3, 4, 5 months, right? So even from a criminological point of view or penological point of view, it's a stupid thing to do. You can't deter anybody with that kind of a sentence. You can't change their behavior with that kind of sentence. You just create this chaos. So stop doing that, right? If the parolee commits a new crime, by all means, send them back for a serious sentence worthy of that crime by trying them in a proper court doing that. So that's one solution that will reduce our prison population very substantially. The second part is what you're beginning to see with realignment, and that is going back to what we were doing in the 70s, when most of the felons coming out of our counties, after being convicted, went to county-level penal sanctions. Most people don't know that there's a big difference between state prison, jail, and probation. When somebody gets sent, and there are a lot of crimes where you can be sent to either prison or jail or probation. There's some flexibility there. If you get sent to prison, that goes to the state. The state pays for that. If you go to county jail or probation, the county pays for that. Now you can imagine, those of you that know some economics, that this is a pretty powerful incentive for county judges and county prosecutors to say, well, one way we can balance our budget is let's move these folks off our books and onto the state's books, right? So that was a perverse incentive. It was also criminologically a very bad idea because counties, while they vary in their quality of their institutions around the state, they have many advantages from the point of view of trying to keep people who have committed minor crimes or less serious crimes from committing worse crimes. That is, a place like Alameda County, Oakland, or San Francisco, or Los Angeles has drug treatment resources, has education resources, has mental health resources, has an infrastructure of volunteers, has educational resources. Those things are lacking in places like Pelican Bay. When you send people up to Pelican Bay, they can't get that kind of treatment. So the system in California admits, Matt Cate admitted at a conference I was at less than 2 years ago, only something like half of all prisoners in California leave prison without having even 1 day of any kind of rehabilitative training or treatment of any sort, right? Even though we call ourselves the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. They actually can't do it, don't do it. Counties can, surprisingly, because they have a better base of resources. The final thing that they recommended, and this is the key to making sure we don't end up with just a lot more hidden prisons in the form of county jails. They recommended that you could keep a lot of people that you're currently locking up in the community if you use techniques like radio surveillance, where they have to have an anklet on them, where you can know if they're at their job or at the work center they're supposed to go to. So these are the primary recommendations. I would add those are 3. Notice that all of those essentially go to what you might call the shallow end of the crime system, in the sense that more minor offenses, less violent crimes. People committing violent crimes are basically not eligible for any of the things I've just described to you. But, and this is something that's politically a much harder apple to bite into, we have way too many people in California prisons also serving time for violent crimes. Now, they are people who by and large need to be, are appropriately put in prison, but they aren't appropriately put in prison forever, right? See, part of the problem with California's 3 strikes law, for instance, is you give somebody a 25-year to life sentence when they're 35 or 40, they're almost done with their criminal career. Even though you may be right that they've never stopped committing crimes, that they have a really bad record, from everything we know about criminal careers, by the time you get to my age, at over 50, you're done. I mean, you do not have the will, the effort, the life force, I'm not sure what it is, but you are not committing crimes by and large. Or maybe you're committing tax fraud or something a little easier to deal with. But you're not holding up liquor stores, mugging people, robbing restaurants, the kind of things that understandably scare most people. So think about that, how that works now, right? In California, we have tens of thousands of people who are going to stay in prison from the time they're 40 to the time they're dead. They represent almost zero gain in crime control. You could let almost any of them out of prison tomorrow without increasing the crime rate. But because you have to pay for their medical care, and because we do such a terrible job delivering medical care, they will both suffer, and we will pay a lot of money to keep them alive while they're suffering during a time in which they pose very little risk. So that is a 4th thing that I think we need to do, but that's politically very difficult because most people think violent crime throw away the key, even if they agree that maybe people using drugs shouldn't be in prison. If realignment, and this is the name of this somewhat...
Explain what realignment is.
Yes, realignment is the stealth term given to this stealth policy, which is in many ways the most, a very radical turn in California penal policy, mostly away from the state to the county, as I just said. But you raise a very good point, right? We don't know how it's going to turn out. The sort of bad